He doesn't depend on conventional media. Farage is brilliant on social media. He's brilliant at getting viral clips out and doing all that sort of stuff that maybe the two main parties, Tories and Labour, struggle with.
Both men, in their very different ways, are basically united by a love of glamour and political glamour. And very often, as anyone who's worked in government will tell you, it isn't very glamorous. And both have found themselves victim to that in different ways this week.
So it's like you bring in a gardener because you want to do a little bit of weeding and a bit of pruning of the roses. And you find that Elon Musk, the gardener, he's come in with an earth remover and has ploughed up the entire garden. And all you've got left is earth and worms.
A federal court just blocked the majority of Trump's tariffs. The Court of International Trade saying he overstepped his authority under an International Emergency Economic Powers Act. This was, I believe, the three-judge panel. There was a Reagan appointee, a Trump appointee, and a Biden appointee on this particular panel.
That is the sound of a sledgehammer being taken to Donald Trump's signature principal economic policy, his massive round of tariffs which have shaken the world economy, on Wednesday night being blocked by a panel of federal judges in the United States.
So where does this leave Trump's economic policy? Where does it leave Trump? But more important, where does it leave the global economy, which must feel it is on a never-ending helter-skelter ride? Welcome to the Newsagents. Here's John.
It's Lewis, and as we were saying there, between our sledgehammers and helter-skelters,
We never
knowingly undersold.
Never knowingly undersell our metaphors.
No, absolutely not. It was a really, really big moment in the Trump presidency, the still young second Trump presidency, because as we know, Trump has always loved tariffs. Tariffs, they are, after all, his favourite word. But his tariffs, which he's unveiled in this term, have eclipsed those of the first term. They have rocked the global economy. They have, it was argued, or they threatened, it was argued, to dismantle many of the economic bonds which have tied together certainly the Western world and the globalized economy in general. And yet, last night, a panel of federal judges in the US Court of International Trade blocked not all, but most of those tariffs, saying that federal law did not grant the president unbounded authority to tax imports from nearly every country around the world. They say that before Trump took office, no president had sought to invoke the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a 1977 law to impose tariffs on all nations. Trump said he could do so and impose these in such a way because it was an emergency, a national emergency, that the country was being ripped off economically every day of the week. This panel of judges, as you heard there, a three-person panel with a variety of different judges appointed by a variety of different presidents, disagreed with his assessment.
And the important thing to remember about who appointed the judges, which is where the British system is so different from the US system, the president gets to choose, and therefore you can be sure that when President Obama or President Trump or whoever it happens to be, Ronald Reagan, appoints a judge, it is going to be someone who is broadly sympathetic to either a more conservative, small c viewpoint or a small c liberal viewpoint. There was a Trump judge on there. There was a Reagan judge on there, and they acted unanimously. Not only that, they said it wasn't enough just to grant an injunction. They issued a summary judgment invalidating and blocking almost all of Trump's trade levies to date. Now, this has got a long way to travel. This will go to the Supreme Court. But it means that the uncertainty and the chaos that has been wrought ever since Donald Trump came out with that board of kind of like the league table of tariffs and the league table of offenders, the chaos will continue. The uncertainty in the markets, the lack of investor confidence will go on. And that increases the likelihood that the US economy will go into some sort of recession because people are going to starve into investment, and who knows what else might follow from this, because we now don't know where we are at all.
Yeah, I think in the short term at least, I don't think there's any other way of describing this other than being a devastating defeat for Trump. You know, Trump has, on all sorts of things, we could talk about the wider sort of Trump policy agenda, but if you really think about the economic one, it is not dissimilar to many of his foreign policy initiatives either, which he's led everyone up to the top of the hill, and either because he's chickened out because he's lost his bottle, or because of legal reasons or economic reasons or whatever, he's been forced to march everyone back down again. And you've got to remember, Trump has said that you've got to remember the overall analysis for Trump. He says that he wants to build a whole new economic model using tariffs. His argument from the start has been that they will raise hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue and that they will help reindustrialize the American Rust Belt and bring new vigor and dynamism to the American economy. That is now in tatters, at least for the short term. Not only that, but he is right now in the middle of a series of negotiations with the EU, with China, with other trade blocs and big countries around the world. And his argument throughout has been that these tariffs will provide him with leverage. These are the leverage that he needs in those negotiations. Where's the leverage now? He's been told by his own courts that he can't levy these tariffs, at least for the time being. So if you are China, or if you are the EU, or whoever it is, sat opposite him and his trade negotiators, are those deals even going to go ahead? Are those negotiations even going to go ahead? It is yet more chaos at the heart of the Trump White House.
Well, one of the things we spoke about when Trump came back into office for his second term on January the 20th was that this was going to be so different from the first term, because the first term was marked by chaos from day one. And we were saying this time around, well, it's going to be different because there's been Project 25. There have been all sorts of people, clever conservatives, who have been working out exactly what the policies should be, what the executive orders will look like, what will clash with the courts, what won't. And the more that this time has gone on, the more it resembles the first term in the chaos that is being kind of delivered to the world. And I think this is but the latest manifestation of it. And you said foreign policy. I mean, Israel, Gaza, that started well, going badly. High hopes of Russia, Ukraine, going nowhere. Mass deportations of illegal immigrants being blocked by the courts. We've had the bond markets take a view of some of Trump's tariff policy, and now we've got the courts as well delivering their verdict. And all of which to say, all the signature hallmarks of what Donald Trump promised are facing serious, serious headwinds. And you can be sure that Trump is bloody seething right now at the judgment that this court has delivered on his signature tariffs policy. Because if you're China, if you're the EU, do you think, I'll just sit this one out for the time being. Let's see what the courts decide. You know, do we really want to engage in anything that's so big at this particular moment when we don't even know whether the 10% tariffs can remain or not?
Yeah, and we should say this. I mean, there are some caveats to it. Some of the tariffs will remain.
Yeah.
Some of the tariffs which have been imposed under different legislation. The 25% levies, for example, on metal
Automotive
and cars.
Yeah.
They were issued under different legislation, so they should be unaffected. But all his country-specific tariffs, i.e. the Liberation Day stuff, that's all gone. At least for the time being. As you say, John, look, they're clearly going to take it up to higher courts. It'll probably go all the way to the Supreme Court. But it's another example of, and I can, look, in one way, I mean, it's weird, there's a paradox to it. It sort of strengthens Trump's argument, in one sense, about the nature of democracy. His biggest critique, always, about the institutions, is that basically presidents and the executive branch is too hamstrung, that it's stop from doing what it ought to be able to do, what it's been elected to do by judges, by institutions, by a sort of series of other bodies and so on. And you can't, these people are working against you. They're working against the public. And we've heard the White House come out with exactly that line overnight. And so in one sense, it will strengthen that argument. But on the other hand, and I think this alludes to something else we can discuss as well, which is what's happened to Elon Musk and Doge. It reveals something fundamental about statecraft and about politics, right? Which is that very often politics is not showbiz and it's not glamorous, and it is about getting your ducks in a row. If you want to exert power in a democratic system, you have to make sure that you have the authority, that you have a plan, that you have a sustained series of work-throughs to overcome some of those barriers, because some of those barriers, if you are living in a liberal democracy, are inevitable. There will be judges. Yeah, you can have an argument about whether there's judicial overreach and about how the Constitution's working. Of course you can. But fundamentally, you've got the system that you've got. So to enact political change, you have to work within it. And the truth is, and this is where I think there is a real similarity with Trump 1 and Trump 2, despite all of that so-called preparation we were told, actually, very often, It's just not there. Trump is brilliant at that moment, those moments. That Liberation Day conference, it was a brilliant bit of showmanship. There's no two ways about it. We talked about it at the time, going through the list country by country. It was funny. It made an impact. It made a political argument. It was potent. But when it comes to the implementation, I mean, right now, there is total confusion, according to reporting from the New York Times and the Washington Post, even among border officials, about whether these tariffs, as at these moments, should continue to be collected. The judges have given them 10 days to kind of unwind them, but chaos in every direction. And if you want to affect political change, if you do want to change the economic model, you have to get your ducks in a row first. And they didn't, and they haven't.
What is so interesting is that you get an election campaign where, no one can say Donald Trump didn't promise tariffs.
No.
No one can say that Donald Trump hasn't got a mandate to impose tariffs, because that is what the American people voted for last November. But what happens if what you are promising is unconstitutional? Do you say, well, it doesn't matter, but the people have given me a mandate? The fact of the matter is, America, like Britain, is a country of laws. And these judges have voted unanimously that you cannot use this law for what you are intending to do. And so they have blocked him, because they're seeing their interpretation of the law says, sorry, Donald, you can't do that. I think what's significant about it as well is that it's unanimous. It wasn't like there was a split. And I would think that if this goes to the Supreme Court, yes, there's a Conservative majority, but there were 2 Conservative appointed judges on this court that ruled last night. And presumably the interpretation of the law is pretty clear then, that Donald Trump isn't going to get any purchase, and maybe has to go back to the drawing board and rethink another way if you're going to impose these 10% tariffs. Because the one point you absolutely made, Lewis, that's 100% spot on, is that this is part of US government revenue raising policy. They want to raise revenue from tariffs, and they were talking about 23 billion having come in the last month alone as a result of the tariffs. If that disappears, Donald Trump's big beautiful spending bill that he's been talking about has got a major problem in it, because the deficit will be even bigger if these tariffs don't go ahead.
Yeah, we should talk about that. Just one other thing on these tariffs, which is that, but I think, John, you put your finger on it in the sense that there is a world. I think a lot of this goes back again to that Liberation Day thing, where everyone was surprised. Something we talked about at the time was how universal the tariffs were. He declared this emergency. He used this relatively obscure provision in this 1977 Act. We said at the time, which is absolutely true, the president does have broad authority to impose tariffs. It's one of the reasons Trump's like them, because he can do it without congressional authority. Technically, under the Constitution, Congress is the one that sets it, but over the years, they've basically delegated it to the executive, to the president. So he does have a lot of authority. But as ever, everything with Trump is to the absolute maximum. Indeed, it's beyond the maximum, right? Because what he could have done, which is basically what everyone expected him to do, was unveil a series of country-specific tariffs, industry-specific tariffs, and do it in that strategic way, or slightly more strategic way. Instead, what he did, because he wanted that big, massive moment, that kind of, jaw-dropping moment, he decided to do it everywhere, anywhere, all at once. And that's where he's come a cropper. In the same way that he's been using, in the same way with his deportations, instead of going through the more legal, the more normal legal routes that he would do it, he's been using what? The Alien and Sedition Act of 1799. Which is, again, highly unusual, declaring a national emergency, which means that there are aliens within that need to be deported, rather than going through the already considerable powers the executive branch has. So again, with Trump, it is because he's coming up against these problems, not because he doesn't have substantial powers in these areas that he could use, but he's going over and above, going to the maximalist prospectus in each and every policy area of where he needs to go.
Lewis, a few moments ago, you said he'd led people up the top of the hill and march them back down again, or was he chicken? That question got put to him in the White House, and it is worth playing because it is so funny the way Trump bristles at the idea that he's been a coward over some of this.
The Wall Street analysts have coined a new term called the taco trade. They're saying Trump always chickens out on your tariff threats, and that's why markets are higher this week. What's your response to that?
I kick out?
Chicken out.
Oh, isn't that nice? Chicken out. I've never heard that. You mean because I reduced China from 145% that I set down to 100 and then down to another number? And I said, you have to open up your whole country. And because I gave the European Union a 50% tax tariff, and they called up and they said, please, let's meet right now. Please, let's meet right now. And I said, okay, I'll give you till July 9. I actually asked them, I said, what's the date? Because they weren't willing to meet. And after I did what I did, they said, we'll meet anytime you want. And we have an end date of July 9th. You call that chickening out? Because we have $14 trillion now invested, committed to investing when Biden didn't have practically anything. This country was dying. You know, we have the hottest country anywhere in the world. I went to Saudi Arabia. The king told me, he said, we have the hottest country in the world right now. 6 months ago, this country was stone cold dead. We had a dead country. We had a country people didn't think it was going to survive, and you ask a nasty question like that. It's called negotiation. You set a number. And if you go down, if I set a number at a ridiculous high number and I go down a little bit, they want me to hold that number, 145% tariff. Even I said, man, that really got up. You know how it got? Because of fentanyl and many other things, and you added it up. I said, where are we now? We're at 145%. I said, whoa, that's high. That's high. They were doing no business whatsoever, and they were having a lot of problems. We were very nice to China. I don't know if they're going to be nice to us, but we were very nice to China. And in many ways, I think we really helped China tremendously because, they were having great difficulty because we were basically going cold turkey with China. We were doing no business because of the tariff, because it was so high. But I knew that. But don't ever say what you said. That's a nasty question.
It's a nasty question. The fact of the matter is that Donald Trump did chicken out on the China tariffs. They were 145%. He doesn't mention in that answer the lower number, which is it's now down to 30%. And China have given nothing back in return in terms of opening up markets for that to have happened. And it was because that the markets were spooked by what Donald Trump had done, and everyone else was spooked, and he folded.
Spare a thought for economic policymakers around the world, from Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who's got to try and work out what to do with American interest rates, to the Bank of England, the ECB, to Rachel Reeves, finance ministers around the world, right? Like every week, you think you've got a handle on where the kind of macroeconomic course is going to flow, and you've got a sense of where the world's biggest economy is going to go, and for various reasons, it just dissipates and it is remade again. It is really, really difficult.
I guess the question is, where does this leave the trade deal that has been negotiated with so much fanfare and unveiled the other week? And we've had this voice note from Sam Lowe. He is the trade policy lead at Flint Global. And we asked him, what does this mean for our trade deal?
The most important thing to note up front is that the court ruling solely applies to the so-called reciprocal tariffs, which is at the moment the 10% tariff that applies universally to all imports, and also the tariffs linked to fentanyl. So these are the tariffs of varying levels linked specifically to Canada, Mexico and China. This means that, at least on the face of it, the UK-US deal is unaffected, given that this deal focuses exclusively on the 25% automotive tariff, which the deal possibly reduces 10% for a fixed number of vehicles, and also possible future so-called Section 232 investigations on pharmaceuticals elsewhere, and of course steel, which is already in effect and should be going to zero. So on the face of it, the UK-US agreement is unaffected. But I think the thing to note here is that it hasn't currently been implemented. So while there are still question marks about the president's ability to impose the so-called reciprocal tariff, the US might be distracted. It might lead to delays in implementation. And then if it is the case that Trump is unable to impose this 10% duty and other reciprocal tariffs because he loses in the Supreme Court, where this will probably be appealed to, that could lead him to revisit the UK deal, although I think at the moment that's a low probability. And the reason it could lead him to revisit this deal is that the terms of trade have changed. When it was negotiated, there was an assumption this 10% would exist, and it could make him rethink the concessions he's made on automotives. Although, as I said, I think this is probably unlikely.
It isn't, of course, the only change that we've seen in this week in Washington, John. Quite a big week.
Yeah, someone's gone.
It's been a week of goodbyes. But we'll always have the memories, won't we, Elon? Yeah, Elon Musk has had the bromance for all bromances, to end all bromances with Donald Trump over the last 129 days, but his days as a federal employee, a special federal employee, have come to an end. He's going back to Tesla.
To Tesla, which he has almost single-handedly wrecked as a brand because of the time that he spent in Washington, that his poll numbers were terrible. Even Republicans, MAGA Republicans, were just thinking, what is this guy doing?
Chainsaw sales went through the roof.
I mean, so the guy, he starts off with a chainsaw. It ends with a tweet saying, "Oh, I'm going back to California now."
It's pathetic, isn't it?
It really was out with a whimper by Elon Musk at the end of it all. But I think it underlines that actually, taking billions out of government, this trillion figure that he said he would take out of spending, that has failed. He's got nowhere close to that. So it's like you bring in a gardener because you want to do a little bit of weeding and a bit of pruning of the roses. And you find that Elon Musk, the gardener, he's come in with an earth remover and has ploughed up the entire garden. And all you've got left is earth and worms. And that is, in a sense, what, Musk tried to do. The lack of subtlety about the operation of what he was imposing on USAID and other departments was such that it actually led to the massive sympathy being with the departments and not about the cutting of waste or bureaucracy.
Yeah, indeed. And he's leaving Washington with a series of parting shots, actually, to the Trump administration itself and Donald Trump personally. Here's an interview he's given.
So, I was disappointed to see the massive spending bill, frankly, which increases the budget deficit, not just decrease it, and undermines the work that the Doge team is doing.
I actually thought that when this big, beautiful bill came along. I mean, everything he's done on Doge gets wiped out in the first year.
I think a bill can be big or it can be beautiful, but I don't know if it can be both. My personal opinion.
Leaving politics to go and spend more time with his family. And my word, has he got a big
family?
family?
Yeah. I mean, look. I should say that is just a clip that has been pre-released by CBS for their kind of weekend show. So we wait to see whether there is more in it. Now, it's all been framed in a sort of gentle tone. I think that people expected that the relationship would explode in a mushroom cloud of kind of, vituperation and all the rest of it. It's all been quite civil. And I suspect Trump will be kind of grateful that it, but
Not a divorce that either man is used to, I think.
No, but it's clear that he had become utterly marginalised within the White House. That there was no kind of brutal sacking, but there was obvious sort of disappointment at what Musk was doing, and they do not see eye to eye on tariffs and visa policy.
Given that half of Tesla is made in China.
Exactly, and a lot of Musk's companies have been built by very clever foreign individuals coming into America on H-1B visas, and Trump is saying we don't want that anymore.
Yeah, look, I think there's a link to what we were talking about with the tariffs and how Trump's agenda is coming off the rails in various different directions. Because, look, what did Musk do? Musk is, I mean, in one sense, one of the things I think clearly they liked about each other is that they sort of saw each other as kindred spirits in the way they approach things, in the way they approach politics, probably the way they approach business to some extent. They want to go in there, they want to smash things up. They think that they're a bit of a sort of bulldozer in these things, strength of personality, all of these, and so on. So Musk goes in with, as you say, John, these grandiose, these absurd claims that he's going to take $2 trillion out of the federal budget and so on. Trump goes along with it. What does he get? Does he get to $1 trillion? No, he doesn't get to $1 trillion. Does he get to 500 billion? No, he doesn't. He gets to 160 billion. And he gets to 160 billion, a tiny fraction of the overall objective. And he does that, again, not in any sustainable, even the 160 billion, it's not in any sustainable way. It's not in a way of actually sitting down and thinking, right, over the long term, what can we do, whether it's through AI or through changing the way the federal government works or whatever it happens to be. It's literally going in and, again, let's go back to the sledgehammer, using the sledgehammer to basically destroy entire government programs like USAID, which he did over a single weekend. And what does that do? It basically creates all sorts of unintended policy consequences. You've even got Republican congressmen and senators coming along and going, what the hell is going on here? This isn't sustainable. It's affecting things in my district. It's affecting things in my state. And guess what? It turns out that government is complicated. It's hard. You have to do the hard yards. You have to do the deep thought. And Musk was never interested in that. Both men, in their very different ways, are basically united by a love of glamour and political glamour. And very often, as anyone who's worked in government will tell you, it isn't very glamorous. And both have found themselves victim to that in different ways this week.
We talked a moment ago about, the tariffs policy having been stopped in its tracks by this court. There are legal cases everywhere over things that Musk has introduced and brought in as a result of people saying that's unlawful, that's unconstitutional, you can't do this, you haven't got proper authority to do that.
I wouldn't be surprised if Doge costs money.
Yeah,
over the long term.
Exactly.
Doge will cost money.
Because there are going to be so many writs flying about I've been wrongfully dismissed, this department has been closed, and etc., etc.
And they'll have to rebuild half the stuff as well.
Completely. And so performative, it's an A. Preparation, it's an E, it's an F, it's a fail. That is what has happened in the first 4 months. And what we've had in these first 4 months is we've had wonderful performance, great theatre, it's entertainment galore. But when it's actually the rubber has hit the road, it's come off the road because it hasn't been thought through properly. There hasn't been the policy examination. There hasn't been the detailed work done. And now you're seeing the courts being the block to Trump's ambitions and to Musk's ambitions. And Musk has gone back to California trying to rebuild a brand that he himself has trashed. Because remember that Tesla cars were bought by liberal coastal elites, and they don't much like Elon Musk now.
I mean, one final thing. I mean, and maybe we'll talk about it in more detail another time. Musk is right about one thing: the big beautiful bill which Trump has heralded, which is the signature bit of legislation which the Republicans have been trying to, the Trump administration have been trying to get through Congress. It's basically kind of building on the Trump tax cuts from the first term and has lots of other provisions in it as well. I mean, we have never seen anything like it in terms of, big is right, gigantic, colossal, enormous would be better adjectives for it, because we've never seen anything like the net debt that will be added to the national debt before. People listening to American politics might remember the Republicans of old criticizing the Obama administration or whatever it was for adding to the national debt in a significant way. The bill as it currently stands, we don't need to get into it. It's mainly tax cuts, there are other things as well. But as it currently stands, the independent auditor, which does these things for Congress, the Congressional Budget Office, estimate that it will add nearly $4 trillion to the US national debt over the next 10 years. That is an almost unfathomable number. It is $106,000 per person in the United States, for every man, woman and child in the United States. And most of those benefits, the top 20%, will receive about 68% of the total benefits in terms of tax cuts. Top 1% will get an average of $70,000 in tax cuts per year. So I do wonder, there are all sorts of questions about whether that could shake the global economy, whether there could be a US national sovereign debt crisis. The bond markets certainly don't like it if it's coming in. But also whether there is, just at the moment, we're starting to see like the seeds being planted of discontent within elements of MAGAism, maybe, elements of the Republican Party with the Trump agenda and this Trump second term. Because never forget, in some ways, the seeds of Trump and the Trump movement and MAGAism were planted with the Tea Party movement, which was all about the national debt, and it was all about tax enough already and all of that sort of stuff. And you can just wonder, with Musk in particular clearly starting to be unhappy, and of course he still controls X and he's still very influential in terms of all the voices that are promoted on that, I just wonder whether over the longer term the seeds are being sown for a kind of critique of what Trump is doing.
Well, look, it's worth underlining, because, the Tea Party movement is a few years ago now.
Yeah.
The Tea Party movement was all about cutting deficits, cutting government spending, cutting the amount that is spent on benefits and all the rest of it, or tax cuts. It was to have a slimmed down government. That is not what Donald Trump's big, beautiful spending bill is. Donald Trump's big, beautiful spending bill is a massive, increase to the debt. It is the absolute opposite of what the Tea Party movement stood for. And there's now the Tea Party movement that seems to be quietly, for the moment, going along with it. For how much longer, though?
Right, coming up, we're going to be talking about Keir Starmer, who's made a speech today, which seems to have only one figure in his political crosshairs, and it's not Kemi Badenoch, it's Nigel Farage. Stay with us.
That's the question you have to ask about Nigel Farage. Can you trust him? Can you trust him with your future? Can you trust him with your jobs? Can you trust him with your mortgages, your pensions, your bills? And he gave the answer on Tuesday, a resounding no. He set out economic plans that contained billions upon billions of completely unfunded spending. Precisely the sort of irresponsible splurge that sent your mortgage cost, your bills, and the cost of living through the roof.
As a headline, Prime Minister Starmer makes speech is not a great headline. Prime Ministers do make speeches. It is what they do. But Prime Minister makes speech just to attack Nigel Farage. You have to go, hang on, what? Why? I mean, are we in an election campaign? No, we're 4 years out from an election. So what is going on that Keir Starmer decides to clear time in his diary to deliver a speech that is just attacking the leader of a party which has 5 MPs in the House of Commons right now?
It's really interesting, and it's something we talked about a few weeks ago, where there was a clear shift, and a shift that I think wasn't sort of commonly or wasn't appreciated enough, but that before a couple of weeks ago, before Runcorn, the Labour line was very much, well, I'm sure we're going to be focusing, or we're going to be facing a populist right party the next election. Not sure what it'll be. It'll be the Tories, could be Reform, could be a merger of the two. Since then, there has been a clear shift in political attack, political description, political focus from Downing Street, which has been to basically almost stop talking about the Conservative Party. Indeed, in the House of Commons, Starmer has basically said that the Tory party is dying, it's on its way to death, and have now, him and other government ministers, basically saying that Farage and Reform will be their opponents at the next election. And I think this speech, which follows Farage's speech on Tuesday, where he did unveil this sort of series of economic policies, much of which again would be, spend a lot of money, not entirely clear exactly kind of how the money would be raised, sort of Trump style, but nonetheless, it was basically a direct rejoinder to that. I think, as you say, John, it's an interesting and perhaps unexpected kind of strategic approach from Downing Street, because the other approach would be to just ignore them.
Yeah.
Not least because, as we talked about on the show before, I can see in one sense why they might be doing it, which is, look, in one sense, it's a reflection of where the polls are. The polls now, for a sustained period, have shown Reform not just nip and tuck ahead, but a good, 6, 7, 8 points ahead, often nudging around 30% with Labour on 22. So on one level, you could say it's a just description of political reality of where we are. And there are definitely Labour MPs who want Downing Street to sharpen and focus an attack on Farage. He gets too much of an easy ride. And you can't, as Linton Crosby, the Tory strategist, once famously said, you can't fatten a pig on market day. You've got to kind of get these ideas into the public's head now that he's incredible, all of that sort of stuff. But on the other hand, what you then are doing, though, in saying that these guys are the insurgent force, basically, you are lending them a legitimacy, a credibility that they don't necessarily have. You're doing that with the imprimatur of the Prime Minister himself. I don't know. It's an interesting. I think it's a strategic gamble.
It is a strategic gamble, and if you just think about it in kind of broadcast news terms, this morning the headlines are Keir Starmer to make speech attacking Nigel Farage. By the evening, producers are going to say, "Well, hang on, don't we need to get a response from Nigel Farage?"
Absolutely.
And so let's make the top of the story: Nigel Farage hits back at Keir Starmer. Again, it just kind of puts Nigel Farage at the centre of political debate. That's the risk. I think that, on the other hand, you can't just ignore what seems to be a polling reality, not just in opinion poll terms, but we saw it in the local council elections, where Reform are clearly on the rise. And I think, arguably, sort of Democrats in 2015, other Republicans, moderate Republicans in 2015, didn't take the rise of Donald Trump seriously enough. They just thought, he's a showman, he won't go anywhere, this is going, and to their cost, they found out that Donald Trump had an enormous purchase on public opinion and a grip on it. And maybe it is right that you're taking the considered view now. We can't just let this go and ignore him, because he doesn't depend on conventional media. Farage is brilliant on social media. He's brilliant at getting viral clips out and doing all that sort of stuff that maybe the two main parties, Tories and Labour, struggle with.
Well, I mean, one of the most common criticisms that we've talked about before, and we get, but lots of media outlets get, is that the media focuses too much on Farage. It's very hard to ignore Farage if the Prime Minister himself
exactly
is pitching the political battle as being between himself and Farage. In fact, it becomes impossible to do so. I think what's interesting is the nature of the critique that he's making, and I think again this is borne out, I think, from the polling, which shows that, as we say, Reform are currently in the lead. If you get to the sort of prime ministerial polling, it's a slightly more complicated picture. And indeed, Starmer usually bests Farage when asked, who is your preferred prime minister? Starmer normally comes out on top. So it's interesting, I think, that Starmer was making the critique quite personal there. Yeah, it was partly about the spending stuff. But his critique you'd have heard there was very much, do you really trust this man? Could you imagine him being prime minister? Can you imagine him having the responsibility over all of those matters, whether it's your pension or your tax or whatever it happens to be, personalising it around him, trying to make, in a way, Reform's great strength, which is, in a sense, Farage's personality, a vulnerability. Because it is true that the public have never, this would be, if it is true that the next election is going to be a Labour Reform battle, people will be treating Farage as a prime ministerial candidate in a way they never have before, right? Up to now, every vehicle that Farage has led in a general election has basically been a pressure valve or a pressure group on the Conservative Party. It was basically a way of injecting a sort of anti-system kind of vote, almost a protest vote, into politics itself. If this is how Farage is going to be treated, it is of a different order. And you can see clearly that's the strategic choice that Downing Street has made.
The other interesting aspect of the speech was the attempt by Keir Starmer to somehow depict Nigel Farage as Liz Truss in red corduroy trousers and a tweed jacket. As though...
And a cigarette.
Yeah, and a cigarette.
Although I wouldn't be surprised if Liz has started chaining it since. She probably should at this point.
Well, she probably should. But I think that was probably quite smart politics to say, look, if you get Nigel Farage as Prime Minister, he is going to be your worst nightmare. In fact, your worst nightmare since 2022 and Liz Truss crashed the economy. By making all these big spending pledges, and the political opportunism of Farage knows no bounds, and him trying to justify ending the scrap on child benefits for 2 kids, saying, well, we want to support the growth of families and we want children, more children to be born, etc., etc. Well, that was a huge fiscal undertaking that Farage made, and you get the impression, as to go to your cigarette metaphor, that was written on the back of a fag packet and without much further thought than that.
I can understand why they're targeting Farage. The only thing is that, there's a few things. One is, I would be worried that what you're basically doing, if you assume that there's always going to be a right-wing vote, Downing Street is basically helping the death of the Conservative Party by suggesting that Reform are their main opponents. And what you don't really want to do is advert to or point to those voters, give them a hint about which party they should vote for. Because the best hope for Labour in so many of those seats is exactly what happened in 2024, which is that the Reform and Conservative Party vote is split.
Yeah.
And what you're basically doing is sort of saying to those voters, actually, Reform is your best bet. Not sure that's very helpful. I also think that on the prime ministerial stuff, that probably is their best bet. On the other hand, Reform have got a long time to work on that. And they're, talking to people in Reform, they're aware of that. They know that their biggest vulnerability has been credibility. And even in the way that they're talking with Farage, the sort of thing, if you notice now, he's not doing nearly as many kind of sort of press events or stunts in pubs or on all of these sort of things with which he's historically associated. He's doing more serious stuff, credible stuff, trying to sort of send the message out there, whether it's in factory visits or all the more normal things, that he's a more typical type of politician, a more serious politician than just the fella down the pub you might like to have a pint with. So they can work on that. The other thing as well is that you can make it personal, but I still believe that fundamentally you need to make an argument and you need to make a political argument. And other than saying, saying that he might bankrupt the country, whatever, this is powerful politics. But on the fundamentals, we remain in a place where Farage is dictating in many, many areas the direction of politics, because there isn't a solid, progressive, centre-left riposte on issue after issue to Farage from Downing Street. And I think over the long term, that's a problem.
But there are other areas where Nigel Farage hasn't changed. And the release of a video today attacking the Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sarwar, over comments he'd made in a speech a few years ago. It was at the time of after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, and you had the protests, and Anna Sarwar was making a speech then about how the civil service in Scotland, the arts, the media were dominated by white people and there weren't enough minorities. Anyway, this is a clip of the advert that Reform have just made.
Every director of a department in Scotland, white.
We believe in meritocracy.
Every editor of a news organisation in Scotland, white.
We don't care about skin colour.
Every principal of a college or university in Scotland, white.
We don't care about orientation.
Every head teacher in Scotland, white.
We couldn't care less who you are.
Every chair of a public sector body in Scotland, white.
We care whether you share the values of this country.
And so with that, the implication that Anna Sarwar does not share the values of the country, which is an attack that we saw Farage make against Rishi Sunak last year in the general election after, Sunak's obvious blunder over coming back from D-Day a day early.
Yeah, indeed. And both Anna Sarwar and indeed Scotland's First Minister John Swinney have described the video as blatantly racist. The Prime Minister was asked about this video at his speech this afternoon by our LBC colleague Aggie Chambray. This is what he said.
Do you have a reaction to a Reform UK advert which claims Anna Sarwar wanted to prioritise the Pakistani community, and Nigel Farage's defence of it, that it was Sarwar that introduced sectarianism into Scottish politics? Sarwar has called the comments poisonous, the SNP has called the ads racist. Do you agree with that? Are they racist?
What we've seen with Reform in Scotland in relation to this particular video is manipulation. And it is, as ever, with Reform and Nigel Farage, trying to divide people with a toxic divide and to poison our politics. And I think our politics is above that. And that's why I think it's absolutely right that Anna Sarwar has called this out for what it is. It is toxic divide. It is introducing poison into our politics. And that is exactly what turns people off politics. And that is why restoring trust to politics is so important to my project and the project of Scottish Labour. Thank you.
The thing is, I do think that actually the radical right, including Farage and Trump or whatever, have sort of won on that score. Because you said, John, when that was made, or when Sarwar made that speech, it was in the height of the George Floyd period. I don't think he would make it now.
Yeah.
I don't think that any Labour figure would make it now. Because I think that the right or wrong, the kind of war on, quote, DEI, the sort of woke, again, quote unquote, not terms I like, whatever, but for shorthand. I think that the sort of cultural victory, at least in the short term, following 2024 and the Trump victory, has basically killed a lot of that, or at least has made, the Trump victory in 2024 has made centre-left forces so wary of the sort of, again, for want of a better expression, the identity politics agenda, which was definitely at its height in that period, 2020, 2021. I think in a sense, I mean, they're defending it now, or they're attacking Farage for making that attack. But the actual substance of what Sarwar was saying, I'm sure he still has views about, race in Scotland and representation, of course. But I don't think it would be something that he would major on now.
No, I think you're absolutely right. We'll be back after the break with Robert Jenrick's attempt at law and order.
Well, John, maybe it should have been, but on my crazy 2025 outcomes list, I didn't actually have Shadow Justice Secretary Robert Jenrick emerging as a vigilante among them. And yet here we are. Certainly let's put it more generously, a have-a-go hero. Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary. I think when he got the job, I didn't think he'd be taking justice into his own hands. And yet here we are. He has gone to TfL and decided to do some filming at a tube station in London because he's very incensed about fare dodging. Here's a clip from his video which he's put online.
Excuse me, do you think it's all right not to pay? Seriously, why do you go back through the barrier and pay? Do you want to go back and pay like everybody else? Do you think it's all right not to pay? Why don't you go back and pay? You can say off as much as you want, but everyone else has to pay. You're carrying a knife, you say? Nearly 1 in 25 people using London's public transport aren't paying for it. So there's 8 officers down there.
Okay, so maybe it's a bit funny. I think he's onto something. I think he's absolutely spot on. I think people are concerned about low-level lawlessness, refusing to accept that they have to pay for the tube fares where they are maybe being mugs and buying their tickets to travel on the tube and filling up their Oyster card. I think that Jenrick is an effective communicator. I think it is smart politics. I think that he will be pretty pleased with the reaction to it.
Oh, I mean, it's gone viral. I mean, Jenrick, whatever you think about Jenrick, he's playing a blinder on social media at the moment, and has done basically since he lost the leadership election. I mean, clearly, look, this is all... Does he care about fare dodging? No, I don't think he does particularly, or at least no more than anybody else. I mean, I agree, it is really annoying. You do see it. It really pisses you off. It's really annoying. But, like, this is all part, of course, of his, campaign from within the shadow cabinets to get the Conservative leadership of Kemi Badenoch. He has, you may have noticed, not given up on that particular idea of being Tory leader. So it is part of that, and he does these videos, and they're very effective. And, what's also effective about them is that he can't really be disciplined by Badenoch because he can say, it's his brief, shadow justice. Again, I suspect she didn't think that he would be necessarily trying to prosecute justice himself, but there you are. There he's going for it. And it also feeds into, it's also clever, a bit sinister in a way, or a bit dark in a way, but it's also clever in terms of the politics of the right, because the online right in particular have a huge problem with Sadiq Khan. Now, you can sort of fill in the blanks yourself as to think some of the reasons for that, but nonetheless, he is one of their absolute favourite targets. There's been a whole thing just this week about kind of graffiti on the Bakerloo line and all of this sort of stuff, and it goes viral. Always sort of Khan content, which is either explicit or implicit in this case. So again, it is sharp politics from Jenrick one way or the other, even if it's a bit unpleasant.
Now, Lewis, how you say that I always seamlessly segue from one subject to another.
Oh, well, yeah, the old Sopal segue.
The Sopal segue.
We should have a little jingle for that.
I'd like a jingle.
Yeah, of course you would.
But I haven't got a neat way of segueing.
Segueing into what, John?
Oh, is it the publication of the paperback edition of my book today?
Is it?
I think it might be.
I would say so.
Well, that was just so clunky as to be untrue. I'm ashamed of myself.
You're losing your touch.
I know, I really am.
Honestly,
because I thought
someone send help.
I know, it was just like, it is a cry for help.
Maybe he could have been giving out copies of the book to the fare dodgers. Read this instead.
Is there a way of saying? And bookshops are facing a massive surge in theft and shoplifting.
What? Your book's getting nicked? I wouldn't have thought so, John. I wouldn't have thought so.
Anyway, Strangeland paperback out now. Bye bye.
With extra? No, come on.
Extra chapter, bonus chapter, taking in Musk, Farage, and Trump. What's not to love?
For every we could link up with Jenrick. For every fare dodger that he busts, we will give a paying customer a free copy of Strangeland.
There you are. For terms and conditions available on the website, except not. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.